Hello, welcome to EGX. Want a warm welcome back to those joining us on Twitch. Next up on the EGX Theatre stage, we've got Bram and George from Aardman Animations to talk about the art style of 1111 Memories Untold. Take it away.
Woo! Woo, Marcel.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. How's everyone doing? Woo! Yeah, so as said, we're going to talk to you a little bit about 1111 Memories Retold. Predominantly the art style, but we're going to tell you a little bit about the game itself to start off with. Then Bram's going to talk a bit about the inspiration for the art style, and we'll talk to you a little bit about how we realized that in Engine. This is my colleague Bram.
Hello. Just a little bit of background about myself. I'm the art director for 1111 Memories Retold from Aardman. I've worked in animation for over 20 years, and during those 20 years I've worked in more or less every aspect of animation, right from modeling through to rigging and animation and lighting and compositing, but more latterly I've been involved in directing more and more. And this is George, our very hands-on producer.
By hands-on, he means annoying. Yeah, I'm the producer on 1111. I'm also senior producer in the interactive department of Aardman Animations. So we've been making games and things for... Oh,
Sorry.
getting ahead of ourselves. We've been making sort of games for about 10 years or so. We started off making Flash games and things like that quite a while ago, and then as Flash started to die, we moved on to mobile games, started making games with Unity and things like that. But this, 1111, is our very first console game, something we were very excited about. Little tip, though, if you're making your first ever console game, putting the release date in the title is quite stressful. Gives you quite a hard deadline. But how did this game come about, Bram?
Well, this is our first co-production with a French animation company, games company called Digix Art, run by creative director Johan Fenice of Valiant Hearts fame. And he met up with Jake Mannion a few years ago, who's one of our colleagues at Aardman, and they got talking, and it evolved from there, basically. One of the first questions we get asked, though, is why did Aardman get involved with trying to make a console game? With that in mind, I'll just kick us off with a little montage of recent output from the studio. So people often have a perception of Aardman as being specifically stock frame animation with Wallace and Gromit, Shaun the Sheep, and Morph, and those more typically traditional methods of animation. But as you can see from this montage, we've got quite a variety of work ranging right through from VR, games, short-form content, and an awful lot of CG work. Probably about 75% of the work that the studio produces is CG. But something that attracted us to 1111 in particular was that it sort of chimes with what we like to call the three pillars of Aardman. Number one being the telling of stories is the most important thing to us. It's very key, and we like to try and include that at the core of most of our work. Number two is to make compelling and good characters, and you need them for good storytelling. And number three is the handcrafted feel of our work. Traditionally, Aardman does everything by hand, and it's an aesthetic we like to carry through into all of our work. So if I show you this piece, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is stop frame animation. Done with plasticine. But really what we did was take very great care with CG renders to mimic what happens in the practical world, the way the surface of the models shimmer as the artist moves their hand around the plasticine models. And it's this aesthetic that we carried on into the gaming world in 1111. So George is just about to give us a brief overview of the game.
Okay. Yeah, so 1111 Memories Retold is a game about two people on opposite sides of World War I who end up forming an unlikely friendship, and that friendship is then tested through the various events of the war. It's a game set in World War I, but it's not a game about war. It's very much about what war does to people how that affects their lives, how that affects their families, and how ultimately that affects their loyalties and their morals. It's a fictional story, but it's set during the real events of World War I, so you visit some of the famous battles, famous engagements of World War I. These two characters, so Harry on the left, which we were very lucky to have voiced by Elijah Wood. Harry is a Canadian sort of 18-year-old. He's trapped in a bit of a humdrum life in a photography store in Toronto. One day, this dashing recruitment sergeant comes in and kind of sells him the dream of war as this big adventure. So he enlists partly to see the world, partly to impress a girl, but he gets drawn up into the war for kind of naive reasons. Whereas the other main character, Kurt, voiced by the excellent German actor Sebastian Koch, he's a bit of an older man, he's a father, he works in a Zeppelin factory in Germany. He finds out that his son has gone missing in action, but there isn't really conclusive evidence of what's happened. So he joins up to find out what's really happened, to see if he can find out where his son is. So here's a little gameplay video, and also it shows you a bit of the art style, which we're going to talk about. So the game is very much based around the narrative. As the two characters, you explore the levels, explore the story with them, but these are both soldiers, even though they're non-combatant soldiers. So Harry's a photographer, you have to go around doing your job as a war photographer, whereas Kurt's an engineer, so you need to go around fixing things. As I say, they're both non-combatants, so this isn't your traditional war game where you're running around shooting people in the head. Throughout the game, both these characters and the player will have to make decisions, some more obvious that these are decisions you're making, some less obvious, and these will impact both what happens later in the story, but also how your character feels about these different things as they kind of grow and shape through the story. So why did we choose this art style, Bram?
Yes, that's usually the second question that people ask. Why did we choose this painterly art style? Well, this is a story told from a very human perspective. When you're playing as Harry, it's as if you're recounting the events during the war to maybe your children after the war, or when you're playing as Kurt, you're telling them through letters. So basically, the point is, it's a subjective point of view. And if you think about painting from the very first marks made by cavemen on walls, people have been pouring emotion and personality into all the images that they create. So it seemed like a really nice, complementary thing to do, because what we're doing is creating a narrative game told subjectively. And it gives us plenty of opportunities to experiment with light and color and composition. And apart from all that, there's just the appeal of the unknown, the chance to experiment with something. Can it actually be done? So the inspiration initially came when Johan Furniss saw this film we made for the Imperial War Museum. It's called The Flight of the Stories, and it's about oral histories from World War I making their way back home. And as you can see, we rendered it in a painterly style where we tried to give it that hand-crafted feel. I think it's pretty successful. It's a very beautiful thing to look at. But I was actually initially very skeptical about whether we'd be able to achieve this in a real-time render engine, because having been involved in this particular production, I was aware that it was very CPU heavy, and some of these frames, although you might not think it, could take up to 10 minutes per frame, and it was just not practical to do that. So rather than just simply emulating the style of this particular piece, we decided to turn our attention to the goal of creating a living painting within a game. I'll just let that run out to the end. So what you might ask is the closest thing to a living painting. Well, in my mind, the animation technique of oil on glass is probably the closest thing you'll ever get to a living painting. And that's a technique where you literally do a beautiful painting on a sheet of glass, and whilst the paint's still wet, you'll overpaint the next frame. And that gives way to certain sort of quirks and idiosyncrasies. And it was these things that we decided to focus on. The way that the paint strokes seem to shimmer as they're repainted frame by frame, and the edges of the characters break up. It seemed like a lovely a lovely sort of human feel to pursue. One master of this technique is the Russian artist called Alexander Petrov, who worked on a film called The Old Man and the Sea. I'm not sure if you can see the laser pointer here, but some of these images of the people in the boats on the corners here are from a film that he made, which included about 29,000 individual oil paintings. And it was a real touchstone for us. But beyond that, there was a weird bit of synchronicity when the film Loving Vincent was also released. And we constantly referenced that because it's a very similar technique. And I think they even produced something like 100,000 paintings for that particular feature.
Yeah, they had people like literally hand painting every single frame as an oil painting, which is obviously not something you can do in a game, unfortunately.
Yeah, and of course we just plundered art history, but two artists in particular that we settled on for most of our inspiration were Turner, because his wonderful use of light and drama, and also the lack of definition in his paintings was quite appealing and something that we've not really seen very much in video games. So that seemed like quite a challenge. And then there was Monet. If you see this Houses of Parliament image up here, for instance, the brushwork in that is quite obsessive and quite unique to him. And also his use of color seems to, there's something really evocative. It sort of makes you think about memories. And that seemed, as I say, very in keeping with the game and the narrative that we're trying to convey here. So art that comes from war is generally quite brutal and largely monochromatic. And you could be forgiven for thinking that maybe we should pursue that in a game that's set in World War I. But as I say, it's quite brutal. And it seemed that something that was perhaps not quite in keeping with the some of the subtleties of the narrative that we're conveying here. So we decided to adopt slightly softer themes and palettes. Because our characters, after all, didn't come from a post-war world. They came from a world that was vibrant and colorful before, and their experiences throughout the war are not solely based on the battlefront. So we played with color quite a lot, and there's some nice parity between the way we played with color during the game, the 3 acts of this game, between the music. Olivier, our composer, assigned each character their own theme, and in much the same way, we assigned our characters their own signature colors. So Harry, for instance, has this sort of nice, airy violet color palette, and Kurt has a nice earthy, ochre color palette. And it was not something that we wanted to ram down people's throats, but it's just a nice way of informing some of our creative decisions. So if you look at the top left-hand image on this very early color chart, you can see that that's got the violet, sort of airy, artistic world that Harry lives in, and beneath that is the more practical, pragmatic approach of Kurt with his earthy color palette. And as they travel closer and closer together, the colors become intertwined and play together. And then the rendering becomes more subjective, depending on what their experiences are. And they continue largely in unison right through to the 3rd act, where, apart from small moments of divergence, it's more of a subjective rendering of color. So just to give you a slightly better look at some of the early concept work, I'll just talk a little bit more about the subjectivity of some of this. So if you look at the bottom right-hand image, this is underground. And what I was trying to convey here was like an organic feeling, like you're literally in the bowels of the earth. So it seemed quite fitting to give it a sort of bloody red hue. And the image next to it, at the center of the bottom screen, that's the battlefield of Vimy. And I like to think of this being like the dead earth of the skin that's got big bloody welts cut into it by the violence of the conflict, which is in stark contrast to the more airy, violet-themed image right at the top left, right at the beginning, where Harry's living in his sort of naive, dreamlike world. So by the end of the game, hopefully people will have felt that they've moved through lots and many palettes and many experiences, and it will have been a nice, rich thing. But how did we teach the computer to paint, George?
So yeah, after Bram had come up with all these mad ideas, then we had to kind of figure out how we could realize them inside the engine. So our graphics programmer, Alex Burke, myself, Bram, we sat down and we looked at what is it that characterizes this oil on glass technique, these paintings that we're trying to ape, and how can we try and recreate those in real time? You know, and one of the first things we realized is that a lot of them, well, mainly they're characterized by the fact that you have a 2D plane covered in brushstrokes, which then represents the 3D world underneath. So that was the first thing we kind of thought, well, that's where we need to start off in trying to realize this. This isn't going to be like a technical talk. I'm not going to go into the bowels of how it actually works, because I don't know. Hopefully Alex will be doing a technical talk about this at some point. But I just want to show you a little bit of like how it works under the hood and how the artist can control the Painterly effect to create the worlds. So this is what the effect looks like in one of our scenes. This is during the Battle of Passchendaele. And I'll show you a little bit about how this works underneath the hood, so to speak. So very first thing underneath is we have a fairly standard 3D world, which has lighting, characters, contrast, albedo, all that kind of thing. So first of all, we take that, and then we blur all of that to get rid of the hard edges. Then over the top of that, what we're doing is drawing this full screen particle simulation. So the white on this screen, you can see those are every single brushstroke that's being drawn on screen per frame. So we're drawing something like 30,000 brushstrokes per frame. The black areas there are little gaps in the coverage of the brushstrokes. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if we just had those two things, we'd get something like this. This is an image from very, very early on in our pre-production phase. So this is, we've just taken a 3D scene, and we've put a layer of brushstrokes over the top of it. And what you can see, there's kind of some nice stuff going on in the sky that looks a bit painterly. But as soon as you get down to the trees and the buildings and things like that, you totally lose all semblance of detail, and it's not really something you can understand what you're supposed to be doing, understand what things are. So what we kind of thought was, okay, so how do we get that? How do we give the artist the control to be able to allow detail, like be able to draw the eye towards things like that? And what Alex figured out is what we can rather do is have extra levels of texture information, which aren't seen to the normal eye, but are read by our Painterly shader, and that then controls how the brushstrokes work. So I'm just going to show you the sort of different controls that create all of this brushstroke movement on the screen. So the first the extra thing that the artist painted was a brush map that controlled the brush size. So this red channel controls the size of every single brushstroke on the screen. So the more red or the white areas on the screen are smaller brushstrokes, so we can represent higher detail, and the darker areas are larger brushstrokes, so we can make it more painterly and more gestural. That way we could sort of draw the eye toward things we wanted to have sharper edges and more detail. The second thing that kind of gave access to the artist was the ability to make the screen boil at different speeds. By boil, I mean the peculiarity of the oil on glass technique. As you're repainting every frame, things seem to shimmer a bit because the brushstrokes aren't the same every time. And we really wanted to keep that feeling in this game. So the boiling, you could basically control how fast the boil is moving. The greener they are, it means the faster the things are boiling. And we use that in some things. So because our character is always moving, we wanted them to be boiling quite a lot. We also use that boil sometimes to draw the player's attention to things because it's moving more on screen. The next thing that the artist could control was the flow speed of the particles. So that full screen layer of particles, this blue channel would then tell them to move in whichever specific direction they're set to. So this is especially important for Passchendaele because we wanted to have this feeling of water like sort of corrosing down the sides of the trenches, that really wet feeling. And the artist could do that by making the particle moves by using this specific channel to control them. Obviously very important for painting is the type of brush that you're using. So we had something like 50 different brushes in our brush atlas, and through using this color channel, the artist could control what brush each thing is being painted with. So some things you might want to draw with a stipple brush that makes skies look quite nice. Some things you might want to have sort of smaller, thinner strokes to pick out the edges on things, and that's what the artist could control here. Also, one thing we found very important for being able to pick up detail is the direction of the brush. So if you want to see like the edge of something, you need the brush strokes to kind of follow around the edge. Otherwise, you just kind of get a blurry, messy edge. And with this direction map, the artist can control what direction the brush strokes move in and what direction they're facing in, thereby allowing us to bring detail to edges and things like that. So all those kind of channels together, that's the sort of basic controls that the artist had for creating the Painterly effect. Now, because we've got this full-screen particle simulation, it means we can then do some slightly more interesting things with the particles. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. So one effect we could use was to use particles underneath the effect rather than part of it to give some effects like fog and smoke and things like this, which just gives this nice kind of shimmering, moving texture to the world as they move underneath the particles. But as well as that, we could also inject particles directly into the Painterly effect itself. As you can see on these welding sparks, those sparks, are, rather than being in the world, they're actually being injected directly into the effect. And it gives a very, very different character to some of the particle effects and things, because they're very much more starker and much more like removed from the world. Just going to touch a little bit on some of the challenges we had creating this effect. Did we have any challenges, Bram? Was there?
We had quite a few challenges.
I mean, it was by far and away the trickiest thing, really, creating this effect and making it run and making it work properly for the game. I'm just going to touch on a couple of the things that we had to deal with in creating this Painterly effect. So one of the first things that Alex needed to deal with is this problem of what's called the screen door effect. So if you see this GIF on the left, the brushstrokes aren't moving with the world underneath, so you get this effect like something is passing in front of a screen door with like a bit of Vaseline on it or something like that. And it makes it very much feel a bit like a Photoshop filter or something, not the lovely like living painting that we're really trying to create. So what Alex did was to use the motion vectors inside the scene to then move all the particles with the world itself. So the particles, even though they're on this 2D layer on the top, feel like they're stuck in world space with where the objects are. The biggest difficulty we really had to deal with on this was the balance of painterliness, is that a word? It is now, versus readability. You know, all through the thing, we want this game to feel as much like a painting as possible. But when people paint, they don't always paint fine detail. A lot of it is gestural. A lot of it is merely suggests what's there. But when you've got a game, the player needs to understand where they're supposed to go. They need to understand where the book is that they're supposed to find. So walking that tightrope between those two things was one of the biggest challenges. How do we keep it feeling painty while giving as much detail as possible? A lot of that came down to those different things the artist can control that I showed you before. But another thing that we put in was what we call the distance to size modifier. So the brushstrokes can actually change in size based on the character's distance from them. So if you can see this sort of white sign in the background and the white high detail things in the background, as the character gets closer towards them, the brushstrokes actually grow in size, because when we're far away, we want them to be nice and detailed so you can sort of see what they are, pick out the edges, etc. But as you get closer, you don't want them to be too high detailed, because otherwise it's not going to feel like a painting anymore. So when you get close to them, they get a bit more loose, a bit more brushy to keep that painterly effect. Bram's favorite topic of conversation, and another one of the main issues we had was performance. Creating an effect like this is very resource intensive, and getting it to work even on current generation consoles was hard. But I think with an iterative process like this, some of the assumptions we had at the beginning in creating an effect like this changed as we went through. This image here, this was from quite early on in the vertical slice. We thought the best thing was to have as many brushstrokes as possible. That's what's going to make this game feel like a painting, and it's generating something like 1.7 million brushstrokes in this image per frame. As you can see, though, well, you can see in the top corner, this was actually running at 17 frames per second on a really powerful PC with a really powerful GPU with one character in between 3 walls, so that was never going to work for the game. And as I say, as we kind of experimented more with it, we realized that actually less strokes, less paint strokes in some places can make it feel more like a painting. Because when you've got less strokes, you can actually pick out the edges of things. If you look at these two images, the image on the left, there's the same amount of brush strokes across the whole screen. But on the image on the right, where we've got larger brush strokes, we're actually drawing less brush strokes. And in that way, you can start to see the edges of them a bit more and actually see the brushes themselves, which makes it a bit more like a painting. That's just a little bit of an overview of kind of how the painterly effect works within the game. What did we learn making this game, Bram? What were some of the things we learned?
Well, this turned out to be a far more organic process than I was expecting. There was a lot of iterations involved, and things would change, because we were writing the shader right up until the very last moment. In fact, we could continue writing it if truth be told. Every iteration would throw curveballs to us, and suddenly like the look of the game would change entirely, and we'd have to go through and fine-tune all of our materials and brush maps regularly, actually, to keep things looking coherent. We'd occasionally realize, and also we had to iterate frequently because we'd realized that we needed even more functionality for the Painterly renderer. Because when you think about it, the number of decisions an artist makes when they're actually painting a picture, it goes into the millions, really. Orientation, scale, brush type, like George has mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface of what's possible with a Painterly rendering like this, and I feel there's many more things we would have liked to have tried and many more things that are possible, and hopefully we'll get a chance to develop some more in the future. And that's it. That's kind of a brief overview of the art style in the game. Does anybody have any questions? I think we're going to get a microphone down or something. It's fine. Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone have any questions, or would they like to go down to that ominously lit microphone in the center? No questions.
No questions.
Do you have any questions, Bram?
Yes, why did we do it?
How much did the main characters change once you'd kind of signed on, like Elijah Wood and Sebastian Koch? Did you have their faces fixed initially, or did they alter in look?
That's a good question. They did alter in look, is the answer to that. We wanted to imbue the characters with some of the characteristics of the actors, but obviously not use their faces totally.
Yeah.
So once they signed on, which was quite late in the day, in all honesty, we did have to remodel the characters.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. The actual sort of personalities of the characters didn't change when these guys started doing the voice acting, but really our kind of, how we define them kind of solidified. Like, you can understand why these people are top, like, rated actors. So they bring so much to a character that we didn't even kind of realize.
Yeah.
You know, as soon as they started doing the reading, we talked to them about who the characters are, what they think motivations are, etc. You know, they just brought all this extra stuff that we hadn't quite considered, and they kind of solidified the characters as whole people.
And so pro as well, like Elijah Wood was like, he'd just nail things in one take straight away, but Sebastian Koch, it's like, his performance is really wonderful, so sort of textured and deep. It brings an awful lot.
How long did it take to kind of make them into the actors, as it were?
Ooh, I mean, because we already had the sort of the actual physical models and things. I think like remodeling the characters' faces and retexturing things like that would be a couple of weeks working with them, like working with the light. Because we didn't want to make them look exactly like them, because it's not exactly them, you know. It was about taking some of the characteristics. I mean, part of the reason we chose those actors as well is you can kind of see a bit in their faces, hear in their voices the characteristics we wanted these two characters in the game to have. So when, you know, once Elijah came on board, it's like, well, can we make him look a bit like him? Can we make the character feel a bit more like him? So it's just about, you know, really like, rather than just going, let's take his photo and model that, it's like, how do we bring that character into the thing that we already had?
Cool. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Cool. No? Cool. Well, thanks very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Hope everyone has a lovely EGX.
Thank you.
That's the end. We just stand here now.
Yes, awkwardly.